proved to be an essential time in American politics. The United States Congress debated a resolution for the early adjournment of Congress, and the argument many on both sides gave was that the necessary public business was complete, therefore there was no need to remain in Congress for the remainder of the session. Whig Senator Henry Clay, however, provided another reason for the early adjournment, which provided an example of the rhetoric of the period. In a Senate building with Jacksonian Democrats heralding a slim majority, Clay unashamedly revealed to his colleagues that he believed an early adjournment was necessary for senators to go home to mix with their constituents. Clay further elaborates by explaining, quote, "Let us go to the honest farmer and take a chaw of tobacco with him and ask him how are his children, how the state of his crops, and what markets are afforded in the present crippled state of the times to the war made upon the banks and credit of the country. And when we meet again, it will be under happier auspices. We shall then be likely to find a Congress more organized and more disposed to regard the public weal." When Jacksonian Democrats heard Clay's words, they immediately rebuked him in their speeches, saying political speeches are for the stump and not Congress. This discourse foreshadowed a presidential election based not on the party platform of the candidates, but instead on the rhetoric the candidates used to bolster their image. In the presidential election of 1840, two political parties, the Whigs and the Jacksonian Democrats, were fully established, each having a distinct party rhetoric. While not fully developed until this time, the two-party system, which emerged in 1828, established their foundation. The presidential election of 1840 differed from other antebellum era elections because it relied on modifying image perception. Whigs painted the incumbent Jacksonian Democrat Martin Van Buren as an out-of-touch elitist, despite the Jacksonian Party platform echoing the needs of the electorate. The Whigs painted their candidate William Henry Harrison, on the other hand, as a champion of the common man, although Whig Party leaders were previously perceived as moral visionaries who needed to steer the common folk in the right direction. This impacted the outcome of the election of 1840 in the Whigs' favor, as voters went to the polls to vote for the perceived champion of the common man. As a contemporary historian wrote, quote, "They seized on the most trifling occurrences and turned them to account in the popular canvass," end quote. The distortion campaign of the Whig Party is often called the Log Cabin and Hard Cider campaign, which originated from the Whigs modifying a negative comment pushed by Jacksonian Democrats, stating that William Henry Harrison could get a barrel of hard cider and spend his last days in a log cabin instead of running for president, into the positive affirmation that Harrison acted in the best interest of the common electorate, therefore he should get their vote. While image perception played an essential factor in the framing of the candidates in the election of 1840, it is vital to understand how the political rhetoric of the period led to the creation of these images. Analyzing the political rhetoric leading up to the election of 1840, one finds the party leader of the Jacksonian Democrats played the role of the spokesman, an orator who repeated the ideas held by the majority. In contrast, the party leader of the Whigs played the role of the teacher, an orator and visionary who sought to convince their audience of what they needed. The new ideas brought about by the Jacksonian Democratic Revolution threatened the social order for many Whigs. This new Jacksonian Democratic social order had at its basis an ever-expanding voting bloc looking for a leader not based on political qualifications, but one who would meet their individual needs. Whigs desired to harken back to a prior past of more central government control evident under the Federalist era, while the Jacksonians wanted a new form of governance that was truly American, catering to the needs of the citizenry. Analyzing the rhetoric of the Jacksonian Democratic and Whig parties during the election of 1840, one finds that the language a political party portrays about its leader carried greater weight than other forms of campaigning in antebellum elections. In particular, the rhetoric of providing a candidate's image as one representing the voice of the common electorate carried providing candidates' image more representing the voice of the common electorate carried significant importance in the election of 1840. In his work, The Political Culture of the American Whigs, historian Daniel Walker Howe compares Jacksonian Democratic rhetoric with Whig rhetoric. Howe primarily defines Jacksonian rhetoric as egalitarian, representing the voice of the masses and not the elite. Meanwhile, Howe defines Whig rhetoric as moralistic and reformist-minded, meaning people who desire to set a virtuous vision to the country were attracted to it. Howe also states, quote, Jacksonians were less concerned that statesmen should play a didactic role and tell people what was good for them. Democrats saw the orator as the people's spokesman, but for the Whigs, the orator performed a double service. He must not only defend the people's true interest, but show the people themselves where those interests lay, end quote. While all Jacksonian-era elections go this theme, the electoral campaign of 1840 is the first to portray the Whig campaign strategy of painting their candidate as a champion of the electorate, distancing themselves from their own Whig platform to garner favor with new voters. On July 18, 1840, the Whig Central Committee of Syracuse, New York, wrote a letter to two influential Southern Whigs, Henry A. Wise of Virginia and William C. Preston of South Carolina. Not only were Wise and Preston both influential politicians in their respective states and regions, but they were also influential public speakers who campaigned vigorously for William Henry Harrison through numerous speaking tours. It was this ability of public speaking that prompted the 18-member Whig Central Committee of Syracuse to write a personal letter to Wise and Preston, inviting them on a trip through New York State. But we are engaged in what we believe to be a holy cause, the committee proclaimed, to put down administration, which has brought the country to the very brink of ruin, and to bring back the powers of the government to the lawmaking of the Constitution, end quote. By the time the Central Committee had written this letter, the Van Buren administration had dramatically decreased in popularity. While Van Buren, in his inaugural address, believed the nation had a prosperous future ahead, the Panic of 1837 led the country down a dark economic road. Even though the panic was mainly his predecessor's doing, Van Buren still received the blame, and his popularity decreased after he pushed for an independent treasury, which sought to replace the actions of the defunct Second Bank of the United States. The economic malaise, along with the foreign policy disputes with Great Britain and the Canadian frontier, and the domestic issue of the annexation of Texas, painted the gloomy picture that Van Buren would not serve a second term. One might make the argument the election of 1840 was the Whigs to win in light of these circumstances. However, one can also assert that the campaign rhetoric of painting Harrison as a spokesman of the common man contributed to Whig success at the polls. On April 14, 1840, Charles Ogle, a Whig representative from Pennsylvania, delivered his famous Gold Spoon oration, where he attacked Van Buren's lavish lifestyle. Not only did Ogle say Van Buren was using the people's cash for expensive furnishings and dinners, and unlike prior presidents, he was cold and unpleasant to guests, he also noted, quote, our plain Republican citizens are too intelligent to look with appropriation at a royal pageant that offends them with its glare, and they possess too much of the spirit of '76 not to despise the little aristocrat, end quote. While the majority of Ogle's claims were highly exaggerated, he had managed to influence the American people. Ogle's speech, coupled with the Panic of 1837, allowed Whigs to paint their candidate, William Henry Harrison, as a humble candidate for the common man, and the Jacksonian Democratic Party as an elitist party that was self-centered and indifferent concerning the welfare of the people. With the stage set and the image of the Democratic candidate distorted, the Whig rhetorical techniques would be employed to sway the tide of the election. Throughout the election, influential politicians of both parties campaigned for both candidates in various states of the Union. At a Whig convention in Virginia, Senator Daniel Webster spoke in front of an audience of 18,000, to which he explained the support of the Van Buren and the Jacksonian Democrats in general were simpletons who did not even read the legislations of their party. They follow a party leader and intend to remain a Jacksonian because they have always been one. Webster's final exhortation to Harrison's supporters to, quote, perform then towards them a neighborly service, mingle in friendly and social intercourse with them, and bring all men of true American feeling into the true American cause, end quote, reveals the theme of community and learning present in Whig rhetoric at this time. The Whig supporter did not want a charismatic party leader. They wanted someone who was a visionary and teacher who would guide and lead them to success. 3 days after Webster's Virginia speech, Andrew Jackson, still influential in Democratic Party politics despite his retirement, would respond to Webster's message. Where Webster urged the crowd to pursue independent thought and reason and not to be swayed by the charismatic nature of the opposition, Jackson did the opposite. In his speech, he rallied the people and put them on a pedestal, not himself. Additionally, Jackson labeled Van Buren as one who would keep the foundation of the American Republic. In contrast, he labeled Harrison as one who would attack the principles of the American Republic, thus leading to its downfall. The style of rhetoric used by Jacksonians was not new and was in development throughout the early years of the Jacksonian Democratic Party. For instance, when discussing the corrupt nature of the Second Bank of the United States in 1832, then President Andrew Jackson wrote, quote, "I wish this for the honor of our beloved country. Ours is a government based upon the virtue and intelligence of the people, and every temptation should be kept as far from us in public life as possible, and all our acts and endeavors ought to moralize, not demoralize the people," end quote. Adhering to Republican principles of limited government and popular virtue, Jackson made it a priority to use the power of the majority whenever he could. What his opponents saw as being fanatical and charismatic, Jackson saw as fulfilling the desires of the people. As historian Robert Remini notes, quote, "All his life, Jackson liked to imagine that he had not pursued office. That office had pursued him in recognition of his manifold services to the people and the Republic." With the Jacksonian rhetoric of the spokesman for the people and the Whig rhetoric of the teacher established, a prevalent idea among the Whigs was that the Jacksonian Democrats were a threat to the country's social order. Furthermore, while the Jacksonian Democrats mentioned morals in their campaign, the Whigs mentioned them more. Throughout their political history, the Whigs saw themselves as social conservatives who took their values of elitism and centralized government from the Federalist Party of the early Republic. Ever since their inception, the Whigs regarded Andrew Jackson through the lens of a tyrannical monarch instead of a spokesman for the majority. The Whig viewpoint of Jackson as a man who would destroy the established social order of the American Republic continued even after Jackson left the White House. In the fall of 1838, roughly a year before the Whig National Convention, the current governor of Maine, Edward Kent, wrote about a group of Van Buren supporters from New Hampshire coming to Maine to vote for the candidate who supported Van Buren in the local and gubernatorial elections. According to the Maine State Constitution of 1819, all white males ages 21 and older who had established residency in the state of Maine for 3 months were eligible to vote in local elections. While the people mentioned by Kent were eligible to vote, the issue was the systematic flaw in the nature of the voting process used to orchestrate this type of election interference. Quote, "I presume you are aware of the desperate nature of the war we have to wage with the powers of darkness," Kent professed to Whig Representative Edward Curtis. The Whigs of Maine, however, bear the defeat with calmness, cast down but not discouraged, and will enter upon a new contest with undismayed vigor. End quote. Governor Kent, a man who respected more the principles on which authority rests, felt the opposition had committed an immoral act, an act of corruption. Although nothing was deemed illegal, the Whig Party painted the Jacksonian Democrats as corrupt and highlighted the negative aspect of the voting process now that millions of Americans could vote. According to the Whig Party, this incident threatened the social order of political life. As historian Arthur M. Schlesinger Jr. stated in his work, The Age of Jackson, Jackson's rise to the political stage brought, quote, "a favorable atmosphere for new idols," end quote. Throughout their history, Jacksonian Democrats had a new vision for the nation, and they constantly looked to the future, to a country receiving the new form of governance that was distinctly non-European. Meanwhile, the Whigs saw themselves as traditionalists who believed in the importance of understanding the past to improve American society. William Henry Harrison echoed this sentiment of harkening back to the past when speaking to a group of Whigs in Dayton, Ohio. In his speech, Harrison provided a short historical backdrop of the previous men who held the office of presidency before Andrew Jackson and Martin Van Buren. He argued that Washington, Adams, and Jefferson were men of principle whose past careers as statesmen proved the worth of being successful chief executives. In addition, Harrison argued that the process of nominating a presidential candidate now depends on how many promises the candidate can make to the people and how many patronage jobs they hand out. Like a majority of Whig politicians, Harrison was against the political patronage and spoils system used by the Jacksonians and made it a campaign promise to reform the system if elected president. This quality of Harrison was admired by many, including John Chambers, a Whig representative from Kentucky, who developed a strong connection with Harrison after fighting alongside him in the War of 1812. In a letter Chambers wrote to Harrison, he thought Harrison's way of eliminating patronage was, quote, as it should be. Men deceived to be mortified when they so totally forget or disregard the principles upon which the general has been elevated to the presidency, end quote. The Whigs may have felt confident that they swayed the tide of the election with this line of thinking. However, the Van Buren camp had a response framed around how Harrison and his supporters viewed a democratic form of government. From the outset, Van Buren supporters labeled Harrison and his supporters as being Federalists from the early Republic, someone who favored a centralized government and a strong executive, and someone who did not respect the democratic will of the people. The Rough Hewer, a pro-Van Buren newspaper, illustrated their views of Harrison in one of their columns. Well, the Democratic doctrine is that every candidate for office shall avow his opinions on great public questions when interrogated by his constituents. To deny the right on the party of the constituent is a virtual denial of the very principle of popular representation. To Van Buren and his supporters, the Whig Party was seen as a party which was denying the American people's right to be heard. As a result, they saw Harrison and the Whig Party as a hindrance to the Jacksonian political revolution of American democracy. When all the political campaigning had ended, the American people had made their voices heard and the Whig Party climbed. William Henry Harrison received 234 electoral votes, while Malcolm Van Buren received 60 electoral votes. Voter turnout in this election increased by roughly 23%, thus showing the effects of political mobilization efforts from both parties. There are numerous reasons why Harrison won over Van Buren, namely among them the unpopularity of the Van Buren administration. The Panic of 1837 cast a negative light on Van Buren and the Jacksonian Democratic Party, making them out of touch with the American populace. As it relates to the presidential campaign, the mobilization efforts of the Jacksonian Democrats were poor compared to the Whigs. For they lacked the creative slogans and large gatherings that were synonymous with Whig Party politics in 1840. However, the reason why Whigs succeeded in 1840 over the Jacksonian Democrats was because of their ability to attract new voters, hence increasing their electoral base with active use of rhetoric. The image of William Henry Harrison as a supporter of the common man versus the image of Van Buren as the supporter of the elite aristocrat influenced voters to change their vote to the candidate whose image was painted as a supporter of the common man. How much of an influence the distorted rhetoric of the Whig Party had on the election results can never be quantified, but there was an impact. In summary, the new idea of American democracy pushed by the Jacksonians had run its course by the election of 1840, and the Whigs capitalized on this by painting Jacksonian Democratic leadership as elitist, offensive to the social order of American life, and neglectful of America's past. Perhaps one may be able to say the same distorted image and rhetoric is central in the current political climate of today, reinforcing that the presidential election of 1840 had rightfully earned its rank as one of the first modern presidential elections in American history, full of distortion and innuendos. Thank you.